Good morning, everyone. Welcome virtually to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Tom Miller, Chief Entertainment Critic for Health Policy at AEI, and an occasional health policy researcher. I appreciate the opportunity to break away from grading student papers during one of my classes. So we're going to examine today the issue of incentives and financing for pharmaceutical research. Let's just bring that up for a second. There we go. Okay. Now, this is a complex topic. It's been examined in depth in many places for many years, but it's always possible to keep it oversimplified even more beyond that. The general parlance of the topic is called the paying twice critique, where first taxpayers pay for the incentives to engage in risky and innovative research for pharmaceutical products. And then the critique is that paid once again a second time in higher prices. Again, it's a complex topic, but we can always simplify it if we work on it. So in essence, the paying critique is paying twice because once is not enough. Some of you may be aware of that early 1970s novel. It was widely criticized in critical reviews, but it was the third straight bestseller on the New York Times list by the author Jacqueline Suzanne. That involved the sequel to an earlier work of hers called Valley of the Dolls, which involved a different type of pharmaceutical product. Now, one of the standard complaints of the paying twice critique of pharmacy pricing and patient incentives, patent incentives, is that consumers are charged and charged a second time excessively, purportedly to pay for risky research that was conducted and subsidized previously by taxpayers, and should be more or less a dead issue at that point in time. But just to make sure that they have incentives and profits, drug makers insist on a second effort at the exercise, or as we might call it, a Zombieland double tap. I was thinking of having our speakers today be set up by their names, but we had two folks from New Haven, so it couldn't work, although we did have some folks from other parts of the country. Now, the other parts of the Zombieland double tap is always have a kick-ass partner. That usually involves pairing up with a innovative biopharma company. Have backup, which usually involves ops and patent extensions. There's also earlier examples of the paying twice critique. This is not, though, a preventive measure where you first pay up front and then don't have to pay later. In this case, it's not buy one, get one free. It's buy one and then buy one again. It's another part of today's discussion will involve exactly who's responsible for the research. The subtitle of our main presenters is When Success Has Many Fathers, as opposed to Failure Being an Orphan. It's sometimes difficult to determine the origins and the full paternity of pharmaceutical research. But let me just go back there for a second. Split second. Oh, wrong one there. The other issue is double jeopardy. It's not provided in the Constitution, although there is a Fifth Amendment argument we're going to hear later on today involving perhaps taking in just cause, somewhat like eminent domain, but there is no jeopardy under the Fifth Amendment in terms of having to pay twice per se. What I was about to say was when we're checking for the paternity of pharmaceutical research, sometimes you need a live on-air confrontation as well as sufficient testing in order to know what happens. In any case, we have a alternative, which is to talk about prizes as opposed to larger payments or patents. Now, this is not the same as the original prize maker, Cracker Jacks, started in World War I, where you got a prize in every box. This would be only a prize in the box that actually delivers the product, but we'll see about that one. We have a wide array of speakers today. We will lead off with a presentation by David Hyman and Charlie Silver. They have both authored a piece in the Yale on the paying twice critique. Charlie Silver holds the Roy and Eugenia McDonald Endowed Chair in civil procedure at the School of Law at the University of Texas at Austin. And his many publications shed light on issues arising in the areas of civil procedure, liability insurance, professional attorneys. David Hyman is the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Law and Policy at Georgetown University Law Center. He focuses research and writing on the regulation and financing of healthcare. David is both an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and alternative days of the week at the Cato Institute. We've rented him for it today. Their most notable recent work, Overcharged, which goes through a number of examples of stories of ways in which the healthcare system charges too much, or as we like to say, stories that are ripped from the headlines. With that, I am going to hand off to David and Charlie, who will give an opening presentation, will be followed up by a discussant panel of 4 other expert individual issues. David, Charlie?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I want to begin by thanking the wonderful folks at AEI for putting together this program. I'm accustomed to publishing pieces that are immediately stillborn from the press and go into obscurity. It's wonderful to have a chance to be able to present the ideas in this paper to a sophisticated audience. I also want to thank the commentators for agreeing to participate. I've not met any of the commentators, but they really are the best people in the field, and I can't wait to find out why they think David and I are wrong. So with that, I will launch into the talk. As Thomas explained, our presentation today is on the paying twice critique. We published a lengthy article examining it in the Yale Journal of Regulation. You can see the citation on the screen. David, next slide, please. As Thomas also mentioned, the paper, well, the book that we published, Overcharged, is really the foundation for our work. The ideas developed there, many of them are represented in the article that we produced, although in the article we obviously explored them in much greater detail than we could in the book, which covers a very wide swath of the healthcare system. The main thesis of the book is very straightforward. It's that the major problems of the healthcare sector have a common cause. They arise because we pay for healthcare the wrong way. And when we change the way we pay for healthcare, then the problems will frankly disappear. The basic problem is that we rely far too heavily on third-party payment through government agencies like Medicare and Medicaid and through private insurance as well, and that we should instead be shifting over to first-party payment by giving consumers control of the money and letting them decide how to spend it. And Congress is nowhere near doing that. If you read the papers or the news within the past couple of days, you know that a new bill has been produced in an effort to eliminate the problem of surprise medical bills, which everybody hates. And that's the typical approach that Congress takes. They find a particular problem and they try to slap a Band-Aid on it. And maybe that will take care of the problem. It rarely does, but perhaps it will, but we'll leave everything else as bad as it was before. We really need a fundamental change in the way we pay for healthcare if we are going to get rid of these problems. Next slide, please, David. The paper is about the paying twice critique. This is a criticism that a very large number of people have made of the system by means of which we incentivize the creation of new chemical entities. We pay for the research that has led to these discoveries by funding universities and other research institutions with taxpayer dollars. Then we go to the store, the pharmacy or the hospital or the dialysis center, or wherever it else is that patients receive drugs, and we pay through the nose for them again. And the argument is, well, because we sponsor the research with public dollars, the drug should be less expensive at the counter. And so in the article that we wrote, we try to examine the sort of assumptions that all of this is based upon and the soundness of the implication that is drawn. So we want to know how often are Americans really paying twice for drugs? In other words, how much of the research do we fund, and how much of the cost on the back end do we bear? And if we are paying twice for the drugs, what, if anything, should we do about it? There are lots of different suggestions, and the main one appears to be that the government should use its march-in rights under the Bay-Dole Act to require drug makers to limit the prices they can charge. David will have more to say about that. Next slide, David. In the book and the article, we discuss the creation by Gilead Sciences of Sovaldi, and look at how the company decided to price Sovaldi. So Sovaldi is really a breakthrough treatment for hepatitis C. I mean, it's really quite a miracle drug. And its research was supported both directly and more generally with significant public funding. So the direct funding that we were able to find is not so enormous, 2.5 million for Pharmaceutical, which was the company that initially created Sovaldi, which was then purchased by Gilead for something like $11 billion. But if you start to broaden the focus a bit, what you find out is that governmental support for research on hepatitis has been very, very, very significant. You see on the screen that the government has spent 750 million on research for hepatitis C and 2.6 billion for research on all forms of hepatitis. And this is the beginning of the problem with the paying twice critique. The first question you have to ask is, what dollars should we be counting? Should we be counting only the $2 million that Pharmaceutical received? Or should we be counting the much larger amount of money that supports general pharmaceutical research? The argument for doing the latter is that nothing is created in isolation. Science is a community, a collective endeavor. Everybody builds upon discoveries and also failures that have been created in the past to figure out what might work. And so the line between the funding that we should count and the funding that we should not count is completely arbitrary and subjective. I mean, really, there is no bright line that tells you when to start counting. In the case of Sovaldi, though, we do know that the price had very little to do with the actual costs that Gilead absorbed in connection with the drug. So first of all, the cost of making the drug itself, each pill is about $1 a piece. Gilead was charging $84,000 for a course of treatment, which worked out to $1,000 a pill. So you have this very, very big difference between the marginal cost and the price. But then when you look at how much Gilead spent to actually bring the drug to market, well, it paid 11.7 billion or 11.2 billion for Pharmaceutical. Interesting why the company was worth that much. But then in the addition to the period to bring it to market, it claims to have spent about 800 million. David and I think that was exaggerated. But now, what happens is after Sovaldi comes on the market, they make back the entire cost of purchasing Pharmaceutical in less than 1 year, basically because they're selling the drug into a guaranteed market where the buyers, the insurers, the governmental agencies, et cetera, have very little leverage over the prices. So they can essentially charge what they want. And when you look into what factors they took into account, what you find out is that there was a lot of concern about the blowback that they might get by charging $1,000 a pill, and very little discussion of the cost of actually creating this drug. So they did the rational thing. So Gilead priced the drug at what it thought was the highest level the market would bear. And it did that regardless of the actual sunk costs. The cost of creating drugs matters on the front end when a company is trying to decide whether it will undertake the research. But on the back end, when the company is trying to decide what price to charge, the calculus is completely different. It will charge the most that it thinks it can for the drug because that's the way it maximizes its profits. So the matter is really quite simple in that regard. We also have another case study we have another case study to discuss now, but one that's not in the article because it's too current, and I'll turn it over to David to discuss that.
Thanks, Charlie. I also want to start by thanking AEI and our commentators for willing to participate in this, especially when all of us, I think, or most all of us are grading exams like Tom. So the recent example is the COVID-19 vaccine, which is obviously another ripped from the headlines example. And Kaiser Health News has a very recent article where they try and tease out the extent to which one of the vaccines and more specific, not just this one, but the technology that's given rise to at least two of the vaccines is attributable to federal funding and research carried on at federal facilities. And people can read the slide for themselves. Basically, NIH gave a fair chunk of money to researchers at Penn who used it to develop RNA modification tools that were very important in the development of two of the recent vaccines. And in addition, work done at NIAID, or it's NIIAD, I forget the acronym, National Institutes of Health, Allergy and Infectious Disease researchers were also involved in developing strategies that made it possible for us to develop a vaccine as quickly as we did and as successfully as we did. Now, the pushback you can see in the second paragraph here, if federal scientists helped invent it and taxpayers are funding its development, it should be the people's vaccine and belong to humanity, and we certainly shouldn't be paying twice. But the obvious question that you should raise about any case study is, well, how representative is this? And so in the Yale Journal of Regulation paper, we actually do a lit review and look at some of the empirical studies. The conventional wisdom, as I think Tom indicated at the outset, is that the government funds basic research and pharmaceutical companies fund translational research. But we think that, and the research indicates, is really overstated at best. Both of the private sector and government make important contributions at both stages. And the empirical studies have used different strategies to try and sort this issue out. So NIAC, Avorn and Kesselheim in the British Medical Journal have a study that looks at patents that are listed in the Orange Book and tries to figure out the extent to which government involvement is indicated by who's gotten those patents. And so they studied 248 drugs that received FDA approval, so successes only, which is obviously one limitation of the study, between 2008 and 2017. And they found that 25% of them had late-stage contributions from either a publicly supported research institution or a spin-off company of one of those institutions. And 19%, that's the subset of the 25, were attributable to direct publicly supported research. So that's a sizable chunk of novel drugs and novel recently approved drugs. It doesn't tell you how important that patent was to the overall drug. It was important enough for it to be patented, but maybe there are some other things that are important as well. And that sort of highlights the point Charlie made at the outset. If we're counting dollars, when do we start and which dollars do we count? If we're counting patents, how many, which patents are important enough, and how do we value them? In fairness, the study excludes biologics, which are an important growing area, and so we don't have as much insight into that. But this, I think, is pretty strong evidence that for a material number of drugs, public funding is an important source of the intellectual property that makes those drugs possible. A paper from the year before in Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences by Cleary studied 210 new molecular entities that received FDA approval over more or less the same time period. And they basically studied the literature, articles that had been written about the drugs during the pre-drug approval process. And they discovered that NIH funding contributed to each and every one of the NMEs, including all of the first-in-class drugs, which are likely to be particularly clinically significant. So that's, again, an important indication that public funding is a major contributor to the development of the drugs. And so that's, a foundation for the paying twice critique. But the issue that we spend more of our analytical firepower on, to the extent we have any analytical firepower, is what should we do about it, right? And we basically identify three options. The preferred option that I think has motivated this session is price controls, because paying twice is a huge problem. As Charlie indicated previously, academics and advocates have latched on to a provision in Bay-Dole that provides for march-in rights under a defined set of circumstances, and they've made a strong argument, strong in terms of espoused loudly and repeatedly, that reasonable pricing, that is pricing the drugs at a reasonable amount, is a requirement that Bay-Dole imposes. And to the extent that the companies aren't doing that, the government can exercise its march-in rights and make it impossible for the companies to continue that stratagem. As we explain in the article, we don't think much of that for a couple of reasons. I'll get back to some of them in a minute, but let me focus on the other two, including our preferred. An alternative response to the observation that the government is involved in funding lots of research is to say, look, this isn't a bug, it's a feature of Bay-Dole. The logic of Bay-Dole was to transfer publicly funded research into the private domain as quickly as possible and without imposing any requirement for the government to patent it, and allowing the publicly funded institutions that developed it to patent it and license it themselves. And this quote from Russell Long was a critique of the terms of Bay-Dole that was offered contemporaneously. He, in fact, uses the paying twice language, and Congress rejected that. They concluded that that, in fact, was just fine, because the alternative was for publicly funded research to languish, because there was no incentive for anyone to take it up. The government wasn't patenting it, and the government, if it patented it, wasn't licensing it. And I think the subsidiary observation that Charlie alluded to previously is this second bullet, which is a quote from Sir Isaac Newton. All research builds on prior research, both successful and unsuccessful. Disaggregating relative contributions is a non-trivial task, unless there's mechanisms for the parties to negotiate with one another and arrive at terms that reflect their relative risk and relative contribution. And that's our third bullet, which I think is our preferred solution. We think a royalty-based strategy, if you basically model public funding of research as, in some instances, an investment in a public good, for which no return is going to be able to be captured. And absent government funding, it wouldn't happen at all. But alternatively, other things that look more like club goods and things where the government contributes to the development of a valuable product and it can negotiate in advance with the pharmaceutical companies or the public institutions to get a return on its investment that reflects the relative risk and the amount contributed. And if we have that hypothetical bargain, we think it's implausible in the extreme that a uniform pricing term would be the result, partly because of the difficulty of determining what counts as a reasonable price, and partly because the history here, which Becky Wolitz has nicely described in her own article on this subject, suggests that trying to do this is more trouble than it's worth, or at least was viewed as such by those who were responsible at NIH at the time. The article also includes, for people who don't like data and numbers, a parable. And the parable is of the Austin Convention Center, which I happened to be walking by when Charlie and I were working on this article. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, well, who funded this? And how are they paying for it? And when I got the bill from the hotel, I discovered how they were paying for it. There was a special tax on hotels located in Austin to help pay the more than $1 billion for the Austin Convention Center. The Convention Center obviously gets leased out as well, and they make some money that way. But they have multiple streams of income, including a special tax on Austin hotels, but no tax on restaurants nearby, even though hotel business and restaurant business is going to be greatly influenced by people coming to the convention center. And I think the more important point for those of you who want a simple parable is nobody's doing price controls or reasonable pricing requirements for either hotels or restaurants, when the logic of the paying twice critique would suggest that they ought to do that. And so the question, obviously, the Austin Convention Center and hotels and restaurants are not remotely the same as life-saving drugs. But the complications of trying to run a reasonable pricing regime are not that much different in different sectors of the economy. There's a reason why we tend not to do that and tend to opt for other strategies. So just wrapping up, the paying twice critique, as Charlie alluded to at the outset, is really just a symptom of a larger underlying cause. If branded drugs were as cheap as generics, no one would care that we were paying twice, except maybe academics. But it'd be hard for them to get anyone else involved in the problem. And so our argument in the book, as well as in the article, is we should focus on making drugs less expensive. We've got a variety of ideas listed here. The most controversial, I expect, for today's presentation is a greater reliance on prizes rather than patents, where we pay up front once and then we license the right to manufacture the drug to anyone who will do it at marginal cost. That way, the government internalizes the full costs of R&D and can use the tax system to fund it. And we don't impose the costs on people who are sick and need drugs. And the same sorts of dynamics argue in favor of a similar strategy for dealing with epidemics. And with that, let me stop. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the comments from our 4 distinguished commentators.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate the presentation. David and, let me get myself back on here. David and Charlie will be back with some rebuttals and further remarks after our discussant panel, which we are assembling even as I speak right before you from different portions of the globe. We're going to have 4 different discussants who will go sequentially. I'll introduce them in greater depth before each one of them speaks. They are Becky Wolitz, Peter Arno, Amy Kepczynski, and Chris Holman. And they're going to approach this topic from a number of different perspectives, both historical and current, and have a number of different approaches to the issue, to say the least. We're going to start off with Becky Wolitz, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law at Harvard Medical School, and also involved with Brigham and Women's Hospital. Becky has a JD from Yale Law School and also graduated from Rutgers with experience in private practice as a litigation associate, but was also a bioethics fellow in the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. And Becky will give us a There's a lot of different ways to go with this. Our recent article, the paying twice critique, certainly showed there's more than one perspective as to what we mean by this, and also what some historical experience might instruct us as to we've been here before and what we might learn from that. Becky, go right ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be a part of this conversation on an important and timely topic of government funding of biomedical research. My remarks today are going to focus on two main issues. First, I want to take a step back and unpack some of the complexities that are implicit in the pay twice critique. And second, I will turn to reasonable pricing clauses as a potential policy response. For the reasons that will be discussed, I think skepticism of reasonable pricing clauses is warranted to the extent that they are framed as a necessary tool for achieving either transactional fairness or greater accessibility to medications funded in part by the government. And I'll also say up front that I do like the idea of moving towards a prize system, and I understand that to be the main proposal in Charlie and David's work. That said, with respect to moving to a prize system, to the extent that grants are still part of that prize system picture, I'm not sure if it will totally sidestep all of the complexities of tracing collaborative contributions in terms of setting the prize amount. That's something I'd love to hear more about. But more generally, I do have concerns about the political feasibility of a more or less wholesale shift to a prize system. And so getting back to reasonable pricing clauses, I view their exploration as potentially being part of this realm of second best solutions. And I don't know that we should be giving up on this policy tool entirely just yet. The NIH's previously and purportedly negative experience that David already alluded to with a reasonable pricing clause policy, I don't think definitively closes the door on this option. And furthermore, there could be ways to reconceptualize this tool in ways that could be beneficial. So starting first with the pay twice critique, we've already had a little bit of a taste of it from the previous remarks. Different articulations have some minor variations, but just to reiterate, the basic idea in a nutshell is that American taxpayers are paying twice for their medications when the federal government has previously funded the research and development of a given drug in some way, and then when Americans go to the pharmacy, they're paying super competitive prices for those very same therapies that they previously supported with their tax dollars. Now, for many, this critique has great intuitive plausibility and really resonates, for myself included. But the more you think about this critique, you have to wonder about what the precise normative claim is that it's actually advancing. And getting clarity on this issue would seem to be important for evaluating policy proposals that are supposed to respond to this critique. Different conceptualizations of the critique could recommend different kinds of remedies. So taking a step back, the biggest question that the pay twice critique invites us to reflect on is how we ought to conceptualize this relationship between government funding on the one hand and the pricing of resulting products on the other. And to that end, there appear to be two primary ways to interpret the complaint the pay twice critique is making. First, the pay twice critique can be interpreted as registering a complaint about transactional fairness. It's giving voice to this idea that taxpayers are getting a bad deal and being taken advantage of. Basically, it's expressing the view that the terms of an arrangement between taxpayers and a private party, a drug manufacturer, are unfair. The private party is benefiting more than it should, or taxpayers are benefiting less than they should in light of taxpayer contributions to the underlying product. Now, I think the transactional fairness take on this is initially a very compelling way to understand the pay twice critique, but it's also not without its challenges. The main one being that accepting the highly plausible assumption that arrangements between the government and drug company ought to be substantively fair, how do we get from that assumption to the claim that certain drug prices are unfair because they're too high? Well, one way to argue for that claim is to acknowledge that the pay twice critique may be trading on an implicit assumption about how drugs are priced. And that implicit assumption is that drugs prices are set by reference to the need to recoup R&D expenditures. So if you have the government paying for some of those expenditures, to the extent that the drug's price reflects those government contributions, the drug company is collecting more money than it should. The problem is, however, that this is not how drug prices are set. And B, more generally, from a transactional fairness perspective, there doesn't seem to be any reason to think that fairness requires anything specific about pricing for the transaction to be fair. Royalties or investment recoupment plus interest are other kinds of benefits that could offset high pricing if that pricing was thought to be objectionable. Now, if you're inclined to think that this kind of answer is unsatisfactory, that these various benefits aren't really fungible with pricing requirements, or that transactional fairness isn't quite capturing the whole story of the pay twice critique, then I want to suggest a second way to understand what this critique might ultimately be up to. And the second way to understand the critique is that it is fundamentally about the pricing of medications and American taxpayer access to them, full stop. It's not about making sure that each party gets their due by reference to the details of the transaction, dollar by dollar, but rather it's premised on some kind of government obligation to ensure that products are accessible and affordable to American taxpayers when the history of a product includes government funding. The thought is that the fact of government funding grants a platform for making demands about product pricing. Now, these two ways of conceptualizing what the pay twice critique is fundamentally about obviously has overlap. You can easily imagine, for instance, that the accessibility concerns can be fed through a transactional fairness perspective. The resulting product pricing might be a benefit that the government cares a whole heck of a lot about and might want to trade off relative to other benefits within the parameters of an agreement. But at least as a theoretical matter, these two goals can come apart. An agreement could be fair to each party, for instance, but might not promote the goal of access to reasonably priced medications. And alternatively, it could be the case that an agreement does a lot to promote the goal of reasonably priced access, but nevertheless treats a drug company unfairly. So turning now to reasonable pricing clauses, these clauses have been proposed as a possible way of addressing the pay twice critique. And I think it's important to keep in mind these two alternative goals when we evaluate this policy tool. And as a brief reminder, reasonable pricing clauses are more or less just what they sound like. They're a contractual provision or agreement that places some kind of pricing limitation on the exercise of rights governing a federally funded medication. There have been recent proposals for reasonable pricing clauses, but in terms of an actual policy on the books, as David already mentioned, there was a short-lived example of an NIH policy that was in place roughly 30 years ago in response to public outrage over the cost of an important AIDS medication, AZT, which at the time cost somewhere between $8,000 to $10,000 per year. And of course, in light of today's headlines, that doesn't seem like a lot, but caused immense uproar and a lot of trouble for people at the time. Now, this policy, the NIH's policy was, at least on my reading, fairly tepid. It applied specifically to exclusive licenses sought under NIH Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, or CRADAs, so a specific kind of arrangements. And the language was very vague. It only provided that there should be a relationship, a reasonable relationship between the pricing of a licensed product, the public investment in that product, and the health and safety needs of the public. And furthermore, the government was prohibited from setting or dictating prices, and there was no enforcement mechanism, which more or less appears to have made the whole enterprise largely aspirational. Nevertheless, the policy was revoked in 1995. The director of NIH said that this policy did more harm than good, and said that the policy purportedly prevented potentially beneficial scientific collaborations without providing an offsetting benefit to the public. The reasonable pricing policy was further thought to undermine NIH's programmatic mission to advance biomedical research, as well as its legislative mandate to facilitate the commercialization of research through tech transfer. Now, on my reading of the record, I don't think it's so clear that the NIH's policy was undermining the agency's mission and mandate. A contemporaneous report that came out of two distinct CRADA forums to discuss CRADAs and specifically this policy stated that there was no clear evidence that fewer CRADAs were occurring. Again, that's that transaction to which the policy applied. And there wasn't consensus to reject the reasonable pricing clause wholesale. Rather, the report found that there was a strong negative perception of the clause and that perception needed to be taken seriously. In any event, for our purposes today, the question is, are reasonable pricing clauses a good policy tool to address either transactional fairness or access to medications, access to reasonably priced medications? And for the reasons discussed above, I don't think that they are necessary to ensure that bargains between the government and a drug company are fair, though they could be a useful bargaining tool. And I also don't think that in an ideal world, reasonable pricing clauses would be necessary for furthering the goals of access to reasonably priced medications. If the US had a reasonable drug pricing system writ large, facilitated either through competitive pricing facilitated by a prize system, or if we had regulation, you know, we wouldn't need to be talking about reasonable pricing clauses. But since we're very far away politically from scrapping the patent system in any large scale way and moving to a wholesale price system, reasonable pricing clauses could serve as some kind of intermediary step and check on largely unfettered exclusive rights within the current system. And so the question then is, how do we reimagine reasonable pricing clauses? What does version 2.0 look like? And this is something I'm currently thinking about, and there are many design questions. But one idea could be not to view them as some kind of pricing control, but perhaps as an opportunity to secure a commitment that links price with clinical benefit along the lines of the work that ICER is doing. And of course, this is going to create second order questions about access when clinical benefit and therefore price is deservedly high. But there is growing evidence that many drugs don't offer the benefits we might hope they'd have, particularly in light of their expense. And so moving the system at least incrementally towards an understanding of reasonable pricing based on clinical benefit for at least government funded products could be a step in the right direction to ensure that we aren't overpaying for what we're getting.
Thank you very much, Becky. Our next speaker is Peter Arno. Peter's a senior fellow and director of health policy research at the Political Economy Research Center, University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also a distinguished fellow at the City University of New York Institute for Health Equity, member of the National Academy of Social Insurance, and on the board of directors of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare Foundation. Peter does not have patent rights, I think, or royalties, but he's probably most noted for beginning the discussion of the paying twice critique with a lengthy law review article in the early 2000s, Tulane Law Review. And then, of course, it was reduced to the ultimate scholarship form, an op-ed in the Washington Post. But Peter will revise and extend his views on this issue and see where we are today. Go right ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much, and glad to be here. I thought I was going to agree more with some people and disagree more with others, and so far my head's getting all turned around by who I disagree with and who I agree with. And I'm going to change my remarks just slightly so I don't forget this, because Rebecca's recent discussion, I'm just going to start with the CRADA issue very, very briefly. And I hadn't really thought to discuss this, but she actually read the record more carefully than I have over the years. But I was the person at that CRADA forum that showed the chart of how CRADA's, in fact, there was actually no sign of any decline in the CRADA agreements with the reasonable pricing clause. I'll give you a little bit of history. That reasonable pricing clause was put into the CRADAs specifically by Sam Broda, who at the time was the director of the National Cancer Institute. And the reason he put it in was because he was outraged at the price of that Burroughs Wellcome had placed on AZT. And that's just confirming actually what you said, but having been at that forum, I was astounded also when I showed the chart. I actually had a graph of the number of CRADAs since the clause was inserted. And Harold Varmus, who was former director of the NIH, his response just blew me away. He said, well, but how do you know what it would have been like without the reasonable pricing clause? So to me, that was just one of the more nonsensical things I had ever heard, because there was the data clear as day that there was no evidence whatsoever that the pricing clause had done anything to harm the CRADA arrangements. Anyway, all right, so that's all off the cuff here. But my original foray into this world was actually a JAMA article I wrote in 1989 that was looking at the economic impact of early HIV intervention. And in it, we wrote what I thought was a very innocuous yet truthful phrase, that the price of AZT did not reflect the production or development costs of the drug. that one sentence led to a cascade of events, including this notion about paying twice for the same drug, at least for me. And but first, what happened was I got a very disturbing letter from Burroughs Wellcome, which was AZT's manufacturer at the time, threatening legal action because they said, well, what's the basis for that statement? Please send me all your data on the production and development costs of AZT, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't, we will pursue further action. So with the help of my good friend, who was a partner at Paul Weiss at the time, and Henry Waxman, we responded to Burroughs Wellcome and said if they had a problem with the JAMA article, they ought to write a letter to the editor of JAMA. And they were in a better position than I was to publicly release the production and development costs of AZT. But that whole episode so pissed me off, and in fact is what galvanized me to write a book about it. And the book was really about the development of AZT and activist struggle for efficacious treatments for AIDS. But in that book, and this is where I'm going to bring it back to the pricing, paying twice for the same drugs, because I'm going to first double down on that concept, and then I'm going to, and probably not very, won't go over too well here, but I am going to describe it as an artificial media meme and somewhat of a red herring. But in the book, Against the Odds, we stated that the American taxpayers paid for the drug not twice, but 5 times. First, when NCI funded AZT synthesis in the 1960s. Second, for the clinical trials for cancer in the 1980s. Third, in the funding of phase 1 trials. Fourth, in the liberal tax credits and exclusive rights granted Burroughs Wellcome under the Orphan Drug Act, which incidentally covered 70% of the clinical trial costs. And fifth, when Uncle Sam subsidized AZT for patients who otherwise could not afford the drug. But the phrase paying for the same drugs twice that was attributed to me and my colleague Mickey Davis came later. And guess what? We didn't write it. It was made up by the headline editors at the Washington Post in 2002 when we published our op-ed on the Bay-Dole Act. This phrase, as we've heard this morning, has been used repeatedly both before and after this in journal articles, in government reports, and news accounts. And I am not going to argue the factual or theoretical merits of this phrase, which are done in some detail in the article by Silver and Hyman and also by Becky Wallets in her piece. But I will say this, I believe it's somewhat of a red herring. The key public policy issue is what it is meant to convey to the public and how is it perceived. Most people understand that if an individual investor invests in a private company that generates a profit, that individual is entitled to a return on his or her investment. So if a public entity such as the federal government invests in a pharmaceutical firm by funding its research, it too deserves a return on its investment. This meme, paying for your drug twice, translates this message clearly to the public. It draws attention to questions like, how does the government subsidize the pharmaceutical industry and by how much? Does the taxpayer deserve some portion of the monopoly profits through lower prices or more innovative drug development? These are the types of questions and discussions that the use of this meme raises, and I would argue that the simplicity and clarity of this meme hits home and has traction with the public. It enlivens the public discourse around these issues and serves the public interest. While this is a theme that goes far beyond the pharmaceutical sector, it is particularly relevant when it comes to drug development. For example, as David Hyman mentioned earlier, the recent study by Cleary and colleagues, which found the NIH funding contributed to published research associated with every single one of the 210 new drugs approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2016. And the precise breakdown of basic versus translational research is another question. Perhaps even more basic is, does this meme contribute in any way to solving the inexorable rising prices of pharmaceuticals? Now, a significant policy change like lowering drug prices will require growing public pressure on politicians and policymakers. And there's very little doubt that there is public pressure, and in fact is growing, to do something about the rising price of drugs. More than 70% of Americans feel that drug costs are unreasonable, and that paying twice for the same drug concept has only added to the public's understanding of this issue. And a simple meme that conveys the public's investment in biomedical research and drug development can help in this process. Now, here's the part where I agree. I'm all for replacing the patent system with a prize model and agree with Silver and Hyman on its virtues. But I think passing something like Medicare for all into law has better odds than overthrowing the patent system in the US. And demanding a royalty by the government that reflects the risk-adjusted value of the licensed technology under the current patent regime, as Silver and Hyman suggest, would be helpful, but I'm afraid it would not necessarily lead to lower drug prices. And finally, and I'll end on this note, for all the complications raised about regulating drug prices, it's always useful to remember that this is precisely what is done in most other developed countries. And this is why the Europeans, and in fact nearly all OECD countries, which have similar patent regimes as the US, have drug prices that are on average 1/2 of what we pay in the US. So I will save the rest of my comments for our discussion later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We have not yet marched in, but we'll march along. We've had our first two discussants, which I guess will go by, Becky, we'll have to change you to Atlanta, do the Georgia State connection rather than New Haven. And Peter will be Amherst. We already heard from Foggy Bottom and Austin. Coming up, New Haven and Kansas City in our Zombieland motif. Our third discussant is Amy Kapczynski, who is professor of law at Yale Law School, faculty co-director of the Global Health Partnership and faculty co-director of the Collaboration for Research Integrity and Transparency. Amy's extensive areas of research include information policy, intellectual property law, international law, and global health. She's written recently about using Section 1498 as another way to deal with pharmaceutical pricing and patenting, and also even the different use of government patents. So Amy, go right ahead.
Thanks so much. And I think thanks for the invitation to join you all and to discuss this important topic. So I'm going to talk, most of my work has been broader than focused on Bay-Dole, but it is and intersects importantly with the question of government investment. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the bigger picture and then come back to the specific question of, does it make sense to incorporate the government's investment in drugs as a part of a component of thinking about what's a fair price for a drug? So first, just to sort of re-emphasize the stakes of the question that we're asking and thinking about today. You know, I live in New Haven, as Tom mentioned, and in New Haven, a colleague of mine here did a study recently that showed that 1 in 4 people with diabetes in our area are skipping their doses because they cannot afford insulin. And that means, of course, that they are risking, if you have diabetes, risking very serious health outcomes and health outcomes that result in ER visits and things, and that are part of the kind of catastrophic and ineffective health system that we live with. And New Haven's like every other town in America. In fact, a recent Kaiser poll shows that 3 in 10 Americans say that they haven't taken their medicines as recommended because of their costs, right? So very, very serious problem It's visible also in the aggregate. There's enormous strain on insurance systems, more tax money, and higher premiums, and all of this, of course, is of enormous concern to the public. So there's a recent Politico and Harvard poll that asked, what should the highest priorities be for a new administration? No surprise to the people who organized this panel, but Americans overwhelmingly put high cost of healthcare first and the high cost of prescription drugs second. Right? And they are overwhelmingly united in their desire to do something about it. In fact, cross-party. So around 69% of Republicans and 85% of Democrats think it's an extraordinarily high priority to bring drug prices down. Right. So the question is that it's important to sort of situate in that context, because I think it's also important to understand why it is that high drug prices are such a problem. And I think the reason that we, obviously there's a component of this which is about monopoly, right? The biggest drivers of the high cost of drugs are monopolies. They're the brand name drugs that are newer and have patent and other kinds of exclusivities. And so that's why rising launch prices and the high price of these new drugs are such a problem. And there is, of course, price increases of old drugs, but that's a smaller portion of the problem. So what I want to emphasize first is this is what we expect in a situation like the one we have, right? High prices are a function of monopoly power, and particularly in a context where, as we have today, the government mandates effectively that people have access to these kinds of goods. So you have monopoly power and then a sort of mandate, which is coming from public demand, that people have access to these goods. And what do? You get high prices, right? That's the reason that basically every other country that has a sophisticated health system and that has the resources, so the high income countries have systems of price control for medicines, right? So when David mentioned the sort of analogy to the convention center and why we don't see price controls for restaurants, right? We don't see price controls for restaurants in the rest of the world. We do see price controls for drugs. So why is that? Why is there price control? Why is it the normative approach? It's because of this background dynamic, which is that the government grants monopolies. Those monopolies can very easily be used in ways that economists, this is sort of Econ 101, right? Monopolists raise price and they restrict supply and they generate inefficiencies. And that's bad. We don't want that. That's not a good system from the perspective of economics. It's not a good system from the perspective of health. Right. So how should we think about what fair pricing is for drugs generally? I've written a lot about this, thought a lot about this. I think the right way to think about what the right price of a drug, so you need a system to establish what a fair price is for a drug. There's different ways to get it. You can do legislation, you can do executive action. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Different ways to get it. So, if you approach this legislatively, you can set out how you think about a fair price and what a fair price is to pay. My own view about how to do that is to have a number of factors. One is the health impact of the new drug. So bigger health impact should get you more money. And another is the cost of R&D, right? Because what you have to imagine is that we want a system that is going to allow us to get new drugs that are worth the investment made, right? These are risky investments, they're expensive investments, but we don't want to pay more because that's wasteful, right? So what we want to do is, if we can put the company in a position where their risk-adjusted cost of R&D make it worthwhile for an investment, then we'll get that investment, and that's a good thing. But we don't want to pay more than that because that would be foolish, right? So when you end up with circumstances where companies are earning hundreds of, sometimes literally tens of billions of dollars more than their risk-adjusted cost of R&D, that's the case of Sovaldi, right? Which David and Charles mentioned earlier, right? Where we know a great deal actually about the cost of R&D, and you can risk adjust it using parameters that are kind of conventional in the industry. And you can see that there's an enormous windfall that's associated with the fact that this research has resulted in a monopoly, which then allows the company to price at what the market will bear. There's lots of problems with that, right? Including that people don't get access to life-saving medicines, but another is huge amounts of waste, right? So in the first year of Sovaldi, the government spent $1 billion to get that drug to people and met 2.5% of the need, right? And that's not an efficient system to actually get R&D investment or to get medicines to people. Okay, so I think the right way to think about this is both health impact and R&D costs. In fact, done the right way, this can improve incentives for R&D, right? Where you direct companies toward really path-breaking innovations and towards reasonable R&D investments, and you don't encourage them to do Me Too drugs and other kinds of things that aren't really adding therapeutic value, and therefore, actually kind of improve our system of innovation. So that's the sort of broad picture, right? And I think that there's ways to do this legislatively, lots of advantages to doing this legislatively. There are also ways to do this ex post, right? If you cannot get legislative action, then the government can use government patent use. So this is the section 1498 that I've written about. It's a system that's always existed. It's never been possible to stop the federal government from infringing a patent. It's been codified since the First and Second World War, major legislation that allowed the government, not just itself to have immunity to patent infringement, but also its contractors. So the government can say, you can't sue us, but you can get fair compensation. So that's effectively like a price system. It's just ex post, right? We're going to figure out what the right price is to pay. And the factors that we use to set compensation can and should include those same things I talked about, right? You can think about therapeutic value, you can think about R&D costs, and in fact, even the doctrine that we have under this existing law, I think is flexible enough to allow us to do a good job as a matter of innovation policy setting the price ex post, right? So government can just, if there is unreasonable pricing, right, that doesn't meet these factors, then they can go and buy generics and pay a royalty and think about this the way you think about the problem of a government laying out a railroad line. Government lays out a railroad line, the last person on the line has a monopoly. That's not a good thing for public policy if that person can hold up the railroad and all the benefits that accrue to it by virtue of just being the lucky landowner sitting on that plot of land, right? Or the landowner that went and speculatively bought that piece of land so they could charge the government a vast amount. Not a great idea either way. That's why we have eminent domain. That's why we should have it in the drug context too, and we do have it. Right, okay, so let me say then, to pivot to the topic of government investment and returns. I've already said that I think it's a very reasonable thing to ask about cost of R&D when you're setting a fair price. Why is that? Because what we have to think about is how much incentive do we need? How much money do we need on the table at the end of the day? It might be $10 billion. I'm talking big money here, right? I think the fair price for a drug like Sovaldi is billions of dollars, absolutely, right? Because that's what you need to incentivize that research. So what you need though is not more than the risk-adjusted cost of R&D, or you're wasting money. Who likes to waste money? It's not a great idea, right? So what we want to do is think about, if the government paid a lot of the R&D costs, why wouldn't you consider that as part of the question of what a fair price was for the drug? Let's say, as with Moderna, the government, according to Moderna, paid 100% of the R&D costs for the specific clinical trials for the new COVID vaccine. And what if the company takes its patent and prices it at an extraordinary amount that Americans are not really able to afford, and there's a national crisis? That's why we have things like 1498 that allow us to say that's not a fair price. We're going to make you whole, but we're not going to do more, right? And even give you a reasonable profit, but not more. All right. So the most important, so I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that we ought to pay a fair price, and fair price can incorporate the cost of R&D. But I actually think the most important reason gets to something that Peter was talking about, and I think Becky also alluded to, which is the political implications of and the political desire that taxpayers have for a return on their investment, or a sense that the government is acting effectively, using their dollars effectively. So think about the auto bailout, right? When the auto bailout happened, the government demanded that it recoup its investment in the auto bailout. And in fact, there was criticism of the government that it didn't do more, take more of a venture stake and act the way Peter was suggesting. Why not be a venture capitalist? Why not just get your money back, but get a stake in your investment, right? Act like a venture capitalist, get a stake back. People criticize the government for not doing that, right? But I don't think it's politically feasible to have the kinds of scales of investment that we're talking about without taxpayers saying that's not wise if you don't at least recoup our investment. And for the most part, people don't criticize the government saying they should have just given all that money to the auto industry and not recouped their investment, right? Even though the same arguments you can make for the convention center and the drug, we get benefit from there being an auto industry, absolutely, right? But politically, and by the way, the reason this is so politically, I think, has to do with things that often people who support AEI are on the same side of, which is banging on the table and saying the government should be more efficient like a business. Why aren't they acting more like a business and defending the public's interest by being smart with their money? See how wasteful the government is? They just pour this money out the door. Nothing ever, they don't ever really get any returns to it, right? Now, I agree with what you guys set out at the beginning, David and Charles, that the government does get returns to investment in basic R&D. Absolutely. It's very hard to account for all of that basic R&D. The accounting problems are real, but they're not, there's certain circumstances in which accounting problems are not real. Like we know exactly how much money the government has spent on certain kinds of research, right? They're not always a huge concern. So I think I would just say to before I stop then, so I think there are these two reasons that it makes sense to consider the government's investment when thinking about fair pricing. One is that things like Bay-Dole, and in my view, much more importantly, the patent use 1498, which applies to all drugs, are mechanisms to adjust for when people who have monopoly rights end up abusing those monopoly rights, like that last guy on the railroad line saying, I'm going to take all the public value out of this because I can, because the government has basically effectively given me a monopoly. It's not good public policy to do that. We have various levers to avoid that. They should be deployed when people abuse their pricing power. And one tool is Bay-Dole. It's actually much less powerful than 1498 because it only applies when there's approximate government investment. But I think the other piece of it is that we should think about the government getting returns on its research because it's what taxpayers want. It's what citizens want. They think that's fair. And if that's not going to if that's not going to satisfy, if people think that's a bad idea, then I think there's a broader critique of the argument that government should act like it should be as efficient as a business, et cetera. All right, I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you, Amy. We do not have a monopoly, at least thus far, on the discussion. I would mention earlier that you can submit some questions and editorial comments, which may be a little bit filtered. Questions to sarah.rogers@aei.org. That's SARA.ROGERS@aei.org, or via Twitter. And it'll be much briefer, of course, at hashtag AskAEIHealth. Our fourth discussant is Chris Holman, who has a target-rich environment with address, although I've asked him to focus a little bit more on the prize issue. Chris is a professor of law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Joined there in 2005. His primary research focus is at the intersection of intellectual property and biotechnology. He also has extensive prior experience and in the industry side. He's authored a number of briefs in some important biotech patent cases at the Supreme Court and the Federal Circuit. And he was awarded in 2008 the Daniel Brenner Faculty Publishing Award for an influential law review article on human gene patent litigation, which we won't be discussing today, I think. But Chris, go right ahead.
All right, well, thank you, Tom. So unlike all the other speakers, this is not an area that I've written books or really spent much time thinking about it at all. In particular, the issues that people are talking about here. And they've written books and spent a lot of years thinking about it. But as Tom pointed out, I have a background where I worked as a scientist at a drug company. I worked as a patent attorney at biotech companies. And as a law professor, I do a lot of writing and research on IP and pharmaceuticals. And so I have a number of comments that I can make. I've got 9 minutes at this point, I guess. Should keep an eye on the clock. I guess I started around 9:36. So let me just, I have many thoughts, but let me see what I can do in 10 minutes. So maybe the way I got interested in patent law actually is I took a postdoc at a company called Syntex in Palo Alto. And what happened there is the patent on naproxen had recently expired and it had become a over-the-counter drug we call Aleve now. So $1 billion drug became a commodity. And what happened is very quickly the stock price plummeted and we were taken over by Hoffman LaRoche. And so the lesson I learned is, wow, one patent expired. That's the end of a kind of a legendary company. Syntex was a legend in the Silicon Valley. It was one of the top 100 companies to work for. And a patent expires and that's the end of it. And that means investors were no longer willing to fund what we were doing because we didn't have the patent. I don't know that investors, I suspect they wouldn't. They're not going to be so interested in funding a company and all the infrastructure with the idea that maybe they're going to be able to achieve a prize one day. And I don't think the idea of recouping costs on developing a particular drug, if that's all they're going to get, if they're going to be working under these reasonable pricing kind of conditions, I don't know that they'd be investing in the same way. I worked at a biotech company called Maxigen, and we developed, we went public, we got a lot of investor money. It was primarily based on the patents we were getting. And things happened, part of what we were trying to do was develop human drugs. We never did, as far as I know. We in-licensed one from another company in Europe. I don't know how we would do that if there weren't patents. I don't know how these kind of transactions, I don't know how they would occur. There's a lot of collaboration in the article I read by Charlie and David. There was the story of Gilead buying technology for Pharmaceutical. I'm not sure how those deals occur without patents. Maxigen, we spun out a company, Codexis, that uses our patented technology for making, kind of green chemicals, green ways of making chemicals. Part of the company went to Pioneer Hybrid, and it's used for agriculture, et cetera. But it was all based on patents. So I have not read Charlie and David's book. It sounds like I probably agree with a lot of it. Sounds very sensible, a lot of it, from what I've heard. I did read the article about the prizes. I am skeptical, and I think it's the way it's set forth. It's at such a high level of abstraction. I think it's hard to know all the implications, because I think the devil is definitely in the details. That's something I've seen over and over. Is Tom mentioned the gene patent stuff. Well, there was a lot of people who really thought these gene patents were going to be a huge problem. And there was a few companies who invest a lot of money in finding genes, kind of racing to find genes and patent them. In the end, I don't think they did cause much problem. I don't think they are causing much problem. And the devil is in the details of how these things are actually used. I think I've got two main ideas I'd like to at least get out, and then I can give some examples. One is, I don't think the prize system adequately takes into account how drugs are actually come to market. And I think if you really should have somebody on the panel who's really knowledgeable about the whole process. But from what I've seen, we hear about remdesivir, and that's Gilead, and that's a drug for COVID maybe. That definitely didn't come as a result of a prize for a treatment for COVID. That was developed for something entirely different. Would it even get a prize? I don't know. It has not been approved by the FDA as far as I know. So I think you have to, what does it mean? How do we define the prize? I did a little Google search. It looks for COVID cures or something. Supposedly 970 products, drugs and vaccines are in development for the coronavirus. Which ones of those, how do we decide which ones get prizes? Who gets prizes? How do we divide that up? I think the reality of how drugs are discovered is a very, very circuitous path. And the way it works is patents are kind of putting down stakes, and maybe you identify a chemical compound that looks like it could be a pharmaceutical, and you patent that compound. And then maybe you spend decades, trying to figure out what it can do as the patent elapses. But then you come up with different ideas that could be used for this or that, and you're able to patent those. And because of that, you've got something that you can maybe hand over to another company that turns it into a drug. So Renexa is something I think of. That was a ranolazine, Renexa. It was developed by Syntex initially, where I worked in the 1970s and 1980s. And they were, I guess, at least in the 1980s, they were trying to figure out what they could do with it. And they did clinical studies and phase 2 even. And they had a problem. It just didn't stay in your blood system long enough. And eventually Roche took over and they sold it to another company, and they were able to sell it because they had patents. And then CD Therapeutics picked it up, and they figured out, we can do a formulation where there's a delayed kind of sustained release of this drug. So a drug that was a failure actually came to market. By the time it did, the patent on the compound had pretty much expired. But there's these other incentives out there that were used. So they were able to get a patent. This is what people would call a secondary patent nowadays. And some people would say, well, they shouldn't be getting a patent on a secondary. It's not on the compound. It's on a sustained release formula. But for one thing, without that sustained release formula, it wouldn't have been a viable drug. And for another, there would have been no patent protection for it without that, because the original patent had expired. The other point is, I'm not sure I want to turn it over to the government, and there's the whole international implications. I'm not sure how the prize system works, because drug development and drug use occurs throughout the world. I'm not sure how the prize system works. And I'm not sure how patents play into it. I saw a statement, and I was looking through the article. Well, what about patents? It didn't really say, as far as I could tell. I saw one sentence that said something how universities would no longer be able to patent. I'm not sure if that means there would be no patent system at all, or does it mean there's no patents for drugs? Or I looked at the Bernie Sanders legislation quickly that was cited in the article and saw that drug patents would not be enforceable. Okay, how does that, is the whole world going to go that way? I'm not sure. But, you know, bottom line, do I want the federal government trying to figure out many years in advance what the prizes should be and what are the appropriate prizes and how much to pay for these prizes? The topic of Me Too drugs came up. You know, I think patents do incentivize things like that, and I think they can be good. There's many examples where you're really glad that you actually have other versions. So right now for AIDS, there's a drug called Truvada, once again from Gilead, and it's considered an essential medicine, but they have a follow-on version called Descovy. And that one, now that we've got the follow-on version, we realize, oh, there's dangerous side effects from the Truvada. That's an essential medicine. And actually, Gilead is being sued right now by patients who are claiming that they waited too long to bring the Me Too version on, this follow-on version. It's almost the same drug, but it's a little different way it's formulated, and it's supposedly safer. I think you can find many advantages of this. You know, and off the top of my head, there was a drug called Seldane that was used for non-drowsy allergy medicine. And eventually it was found to be dangerous, had side effects. And luckily we had Allegra and things like that. And so they were able to pull it off the market because we do have Allegra. I've got some arthritis in my ankle. I like Celebrex, but I know actually what Celebrex is, it's called a COX-2 inhibitor. It's definitely a Me Too because we already had COX-1 inhibitors. That was aspirin, we had ibuprofen, there's all these different versions. But what it was realized is, oh, maybe a COX-2 inhibitor would be a way to avoid the gastrointestinal effects. And so different companies went for that. And we had Vioxx. And let's say Vioxx was the first. Would Vioxx get the prize? Well, if they got the prize, would there have been a Celebrex? And what we know is Vioxx was found to have dangerous effects on the heart. So it's been yanked off the market, but luckily we do have Celebrex. You know, the insulin. Insulin's been around for a long time. You know, my grandma took insulin. It was probably from a pig, I think. It wasn't human. But even the original human versions, those are all off patent. If there was a market for it, if people really wanted to take the older versions, that they should be available. The reason we're having problems, and maybe as a practical reality, if you're the patient, they're just not available. But it's not because of IP. You know, you definitely could bring older versions on. We consider these follow-ons to be essential. Okay, so those are just a few thoughts. I think my time is up if it's 10 minutes, and I'll just happy to listen and maybe comment.
Thank you very much, Chris. We're getting some audience questions coming in now with a little bit of a lag, which always happens with research and development. We didn't offer a large enough patent up front, but I will save most of those for some rebuttal after some rebuttal comments by David and Charlie. Let me just tee up one generalized question, which you can pretend to answer while each of you end up improvising and extending your remarks on the discussant panel, which is in one form or another, most of you indicated that the objections are not primarily, after all is said and done, about the incentives for research and the riskiness, but it's somewhat of a proxy. In drug development, we have target opportunities in which to deal with what you're really going after, which is how you feel about the pricing for pharmaceuticals. So to what extent is this kind of something that should be seen in its own narrow terms in terms of the research paying twice critique, or do we need different types of profit enhancing inhibitors is what this discussion is mostly about, or disagree accordingly? But I'll go sequentially with those of you who spoke initially, so we can start with Becky and just go around the horn once. Becky?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just going to repeat some of my remarks. You know, I think that, I agree with what Peter said, that I think the pay twice critique is largely a rhetorical tool. And I think we would be well served to use perhaps more precise language or other ways of describing what I think are distinct problems, the problems that all the other panelists have mentioned is, the desire of the public to get a reasonable return on their investment. We just don't want to be throwing money away. We want to be making sure that we're not, as taxpayers, being taken advantage of. But, competing with those concerns are also issues of access to reasonably priced and affordable medications in our country. As Amy pointed out, 1 in 4 people who can't afford their diabetes medication, that's a really distressing state of affairs. And, I think we need solutions to address both of those issues, and the pay twice critique kind of meshes them together in ways that may or may not be that helpful.
Peter, you seem to have moved on to another stage of the debate, but let's hear your own thoughts on this.
I'm a little unclear. What specifically is the question?
Oh, the question is whatever you want to answer is the way it usually works, but I was just trying to pretend there was a question on the table.
Oh, okay.
That's all right. Don't feel obligated. We've already indicated your point of view. I'll move on to Amy. Any further thoughts?
I guess I think that it's useful to think about the paying twice critique through a particular lens. And that's the lens that, it's important that there be fair prices for drugs. And so if you guys are happier saying, hey, instead of talking about paying twice, let's talk about fair pricing for drugs. And part of that is, well, what were the R&D outlays? And did you get, return on your investment that was reasonable, but not a windfall? Then I think that's reasonable. Obviously we're not going to control like how everybody else talks and thinks about this. But to me, the core of the question is, are drugs fairly priced? And are we designing a smart innovation policy that both enables access to medicines, because you develop drugs that people can't afford and they don't really have a benefit, and that also pays for R&D in a reasonable way.
All right. Chris, any further thoughts? Sometimes it's a matter of time, and sometimes you don't know what you have until you have it, but just some closing remarks.
Okay. I'm kind of like Peter. I'm not sure what the question was, but I can talk a little bit about
what the answer is.
Yeah, that's the key. To me, there was the analogy of walking by the Austin Convention Center. To invent an analogy that comes to my mind is, if the government enters into a contract with someone to paint a building, and they enter into terms, and then once it's been painted, they decide, well, we can save money because we're the government. We figured out they can't actually enforce the contract against us. So we agreed to pay $100,000, but I think, look, it didn't cost them that much to paint the building. Let's pay them $15,000. I think you could do that. You save money in the short run, but I think the problem is you start doing that and people start thinking twice before they enter into agreements with the government to paint buildings. And I think it's a much more complicated agreement, but you can think of it as kind of a contract. The government has come in and they've encouraged people, please come in. We will work with you. We will work with you as a private company, and we will license technology to you, and we will provide all these incentives. And we want you, here's your end of the deal. Is you develop this drug, and if you do, this is the arrangement. Here's the incentives we put for you. And then once it's been complied with, we're coming and saying, well, it's kind of a bait and switch. Actually, we don't have to live up to our obligations. We're the government. And so, yes, in the short term, you can bring down the prices. But I think the obvious problem becomes, are they going to agree to do it the next time? And I think one other thought. It seems like a lot of what we're saying is, well, the government could have negotiated this. They could have negotiated reasonable terms or whatever, but they haven't. And maybe it's not good. The government is not good at doing those kind of things. But if they're not, are they really going to be good at defining these prices way out in advance? And the whole political problem of that how are they going to figure out how much to pay for something that doesn't exist yet and it's going to be way in the future? They have hard enough time paying for things that already exist. I don't see them paying the amount of money necessary for things that are that far out in the future.
Well, it always works with Pentagon weapon systems, but we'll see in this case. We're going to thank our panelists for the robust discussion. And if we can bring back on David and Charlie, who are on screen, but I think they're still currently muted, which is how I like most of my guests most of the time. But we'll see if they have any pent up further comments on what's been discussed thus far before we go to some of our audience and my questions? David, Charlie, have at it.
David?
I'd make a couple of quick points. I think there's lots of complications in sorting out a prize system. We say as much in the piece that the devil is in the details. And there's lots of reasons for thinking prize systems will work poorly. But at the same time, the issue is compared to what, right? You need to compare a flawed and problematic prize system that we have some examples of with a flawed and problematic patent system that has the kinds of consequences that we and the other commentators have talked about. That's the first observation. Second, the clinical benefit issue, I think, is very important. It's worth asking, why doesn't our current payment system reflect the clinical benefit? What are the political and institutional constraints that make it hard for our system to say, we will pay you huge amounts of money for this drug that has huge clinical benefits, and we will pay you nothing whatsoever for this other drug that doesn't work or doesn't work nearly as well as something else. And the payment system, I think Peter's the only person that commented on the payment system, is a sort of important partner in the dysfunctions that we see. And that's why we frame this around, you should make drugs cheaper rather than simply viewing this as, let's do a patent system, a prize system for its own right. The third quick observation I would make is I want to echo Chris's comments about Me Too drugs. If we had a functioning market for drugs, Me Too drugs would not be remotely problematic. They'd be hugely beneficial because they would create price competition, right? Nobody talks about the evils of Me Too hotels and Me Too restaurants and Me Too car companies. Why is it that in pharmaceuticals, the Me Too drug can come in at the same price or sometimes even higher? And the last point I'd make just very quickly is, a well-known commentator, Mark Pauly, said, why is it that there's no market for last year's drugs at last year's prices, right? And so it's worth thinking about what the demand side of this equation looks like and not just the supply side. Let me stop there.
That's what product copying is all about, make it look slightly different. But Charlie, did you have further elaborations?
Yeah, the first thing I want to do is echo David's point that, it's always compared to what. If you're looking for a system that both incentivizes research perfectly and charges the perfect price or pays the perfect price for drugs or other creatures, then you're caught up in the nirvana fantasy, and you're not going to find anything that satisfies you. It's always a question of how bad will prizes be relative to patents and vice versa. And we know that the devil we know has lots of problems. I mean, for example, Amy was talking about the problem of purchasing insulin in New Haven. Well, insulin's an old drug, right? It's been around for decades and decades. And in fact, if I recall correctly, when it was discovered, it wasn't even patented because the inventor believed that it should be available to everyone. But here we find ourselves in the current system with only, I think, 3 major producers of insulin, and they're not competing with each other. There's a wonderful series of charts, you can find them in our book, although we didn't create them, about lockstep pricing for insulin over many years. And the same is true for other drugs like epinephrine, right? Epinephrine's an old drug. And when you buy it just as a drug, it's, $1 a dose or something like that. But when you buy an EpiPen, it's $750 for an EpiPen. Why? Because of a lack of competition. So, I agree with Chris that you could imagine a parade of horribles under a prize system, but you don't have to imagine a parade of horribles under the patent system because there is a parade of horribles already. And so I think what we really need to do is try harder to do good research and thinking about this and talk about talk about prizes in an experimental way. We can think about how we might implement a prize system for certain drug targets and see how it works. And if it doesn't work, well, we tried. And then, of course, the other thing is how politically feasible is our proposal, which is what Rebecca asked. And, I'm never really sure how politically feasible anything is. You know, Medicare wasn't politically feasible when Harry Truman proposed it, but Harry Truman was still alive when Johnson signed the Medicare bill, and he was there, right? So in a short period of time after it wasn't politically feasible, it was. And of course, before President Obama was president, no one would have said that national health care or anything like it was feasible. But, you know, the Clinton plan failed, and then we had Obamacare within a fairly short period of years. Things change, and now we're in the midst of a very big change driven by COVID, right? COVID has destroyed lots of barriers that were previously politically unassailable. So we have, for example, wiped out restrictions on interjurisdictional practice, wiped out restrictions on telemedicine, wiped out scope of practice restrictions. These things, you know, really, they were unthinkable before COVID. And now I think we're never going back to the world before COVID. So we have to be open-minded and see if support for a particular system can be developed. And of course, that takes evidence, and it takes organization, and it takes time. And, you know, those are things that as academics, we're not very good at. So I view my job as put the ideas out there, see if you can help people formulate them. And on the last point, by the way, here in Texas, we are working on a pilot project for the expansion of Medicaid. And if it's successful, it would require legislative support and a waiver from HHS. But if it's successful, it will change the way Medicaid works by giving the expansion population members money. It won't give them health care. It will give them money which they can use to buy health care, along with a major medical policy for catastrophes. Well, that's an experiment. Has the potential to really revolutionize the delivery of healthcare to the poor population by encouraging the use of retail medicine, which I believe is the future. And if we collect evidence that shows that the expansion population is served well by this experiment, I can imagine something that is politically inconceivable now becoming conceivable. David and I have written extensively about giving poor people the money and letting them use it to buy the healthcare they need. Today, it's a laugher, but maybe 10 years from now, it won't be. Who knows? Thank you.
All right, sounds like that may be co-sponsored by Aflac, where if you give them cash, it's just as good as money. You're interested, I was interested in that experiment on a targeted approach to prizes per, I don't know how you could do a double-blind clinical trial where half the pharma investors get a prize and half of them get a patent. It might be the approach to doing it. So they win either way, but that might be the way our system normally works. More particular distinction from a little bit in the direction of where Amy was coming from in terms of using 1498 and eminent domain. I just want to ask a question this way, which is a timing factor. A lot of these discussions are about whether we should price ex ante or ex post. Because if you do ex post, you're in a different situation in terms of being able to change the deal. And they say, oh, it's too difficult to determine in advance what the potential provisions would be where we have a stake in it. So why do we not know what time it is when it comes to providing the incentives for this research?
Well, I think ex ante you have ignorance and ex post you have opportunism. And the question is, which of those is a bigger problem? You know, I mean, I think the risks for ex post expropriation is an important part of the reason why we see drug development patterns internationally that look the way that they do, right? You'll be happy to develop drugs that will affect mostly well-insured, wealthy people. And you're not so keen on drugs that mostly affect populations that have less money and are located in countries that might be happy to expropriate your patents. And that's a problem of the existing patent system. It's part of the reason why we see advanced market commitments and things like that as a way of creating an incentive, right? Incentives, you always want to try and set things up so that the incentives are aligned, because it's a lot easier to make water run downhill than uphill.
What would a market look like where it's almost split in two? There's the set of signals and the incentives and the reactions for doing the research and the refined research. But then once it's there, what happens afterwards in terms of product development? Because you're talking about a front end stage for the type of extended research, but there's going to be another stage of product development, isn't there?
I'm not sure exactly what you're saying, but one of the things that has occurred to me while people have been talking about the impact of a shift to a prize system is, what are the incentives that motivate the research on the academic side? To what extent do academic researchers depend upon the emoluments that come from the sale of patents to do their work? My impression is that academics do it because of other reasons, right? We get grants, well, not law professors, but the scientists who do the research get grants. And we live in a world where you have to publish or perish, right? I mean, that is the way of gaining prominence in your field. And so I don't know that removing the patent system would necessarily impact the incentives for basic research all that much. They would probably have some marginal effect because the universities like the money that they get by selling these things. But I don't know how thoroughgoing that impact would be. It'd be interesting to try to find that out.
Let me just try to flesh it out this way. After the prize is awarded and the research has been done, what happens next? We're going to have a lot of other variations and changes in how pharmaceutical products are developed beyond that research, aren't we? And how does the regime work then?
One possibility is simply to revert to the trade secret practices that existed before, right? The trade-off for patents is that in return for giving the public the benefit of the knowledge that went into the product, you get market exclusivity. And we should take a look at that trade-off. We know that in some areas that trade-off is not working very well. And trade secrets provides a different opportunity to do that. So, it's not like we would go from complete openness or complete patent to no secrecy at all. We would have some regime there, but now I'm somewhat out of my depths here. I'm not an IP guy. We have two of them here. They should be talking about this instead.
I'd jump in on the international question. I mean, so David raises a good question about whether or not the reason there's not more development for drugs for neglected diseases is the kind of threat of expropriation. I think it's just there's no market, right? All of Africa is 1% of the world's pharmaceutical market. India is about 2%. Right. And these are high cost, innovations. There's not enough money in it. And so it's got nothing to do with that question. In fact, most countries don't ever use the power that they have under international law. Part of the reason I wanted to interject is because there's really nothing more timely than the question of whether or not those kinds of actions to allow generic vaccines to be made available abroad are going to be, kind of accepted by the US and by the EU. And I just don't want to leave people with the impression that it's unwise for countries to go about using those authorities to make COVID vaccines available. Maybe the only way most of the world actually gets COVID vaccines. We'll have to see. But part of the issue there is just that the global market is so profoundly skewed. And that isn't because of different treatment of IP. As you know, IP law is basically standardized through the TRIPS agreement. It's because the amount of money in healthcare in rich countries so vastly swamps the amount of money in healthcare in the developing world. And so, I think the right way to think about this is, can we get health benefits? And in fact, we would benefit from tremendously in the US around COVID vaccines if the rest of the world were vaccinated for a reasonable cost. Innovation, which can be extremely small given the tiny markets that we're talking about.
We had some discussion as to the nefarious, always parameters to be charted later, risk-adjusted approach to research incentives. But the other side of this is value-based pricing. That's a question from one of our audience participants. And what does that really mean in this world? I mean, we've had that phrase around for a while. There's some real examples of it, some more illusional, aspirational ones. This is more for David and Charlie. In this reformed world, would value-based pricing answer some of your questions, or is it a solution in search of another solution?
Charlie, you first.
Well, I'm not keen on value-based pricing, frankly, except perhaps as a second best solution. In competitive markets, value to the consumer places a ceiling on what the consumer will pay. But competition tends to drive prices down far below the value that the consumer will pay. That's why we have consumer surplus in competitive markets. So, I guess we wouldn't want to pay more than the value of a pharmaceutical somehow conceived, but I'd be quite happy to pay a lot less if we could figure out how to do that while preserving the incentives to create drugs.
Yeah, so one of Charlie and my first unsuccessful articles was on what we called result-based compensation agreements. It turns out RBCA is a horrible acronym. If you call it P4P, suddenly you get invited to all the cool conferences and you can, sell your consulting services to the government. So payment for performance, obviously, is something people are quite concerned about. You ought to worry about a system where we're not paying you based on your performance, at least if we're able to measure it.
Sounds like you were responding to the market signals, David.
Yeah, well, I'm bad at acronyms. What can I tell you? But again, this goes back to the point I think Becky made at the outset, which is there's EISER, and other organizations, NICE, the British government version of this, which basically try and figure out how much we ought to pay for particular drugs. And we're allergic, apparently, to doing that, right? So PPACA or Obamacare, which Charlie alluded to, basically set up an organization to do cost effectiveness research, but explicitly prohibited its use in making coverage decisions, right? So, the bloody shirt of rationing gets waved anytime people talk about centralized purchasing that incorporates anything other than tell us what you want and tell us how much you want to be paid, and we'll cut you a check. And that's created the kinds of problems that we're dealing with now.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Sure, Peter, go ahead.
Well, going back to the earlier comment about social change, the kind of restrictions that were placed on doing cost effectiveness analysis under the ACA, that can certainly be changed. And if we looked a little more towards what works in the world versus what we have in the United States that works less well, we might be better off. So, for example, you mentioned NICE and EISER in the US. We can move towards that. Yes, politically it's difficult, but what drives these kinds of changes is basically, in my view, political and social movements that demand something be done about the high price of drugs. And that's one way of not only dealing with the high prices, but trying to get more efficacious treatments and treatments that are needed for the public health than we have now. And I just want to go back and reiterate one comment I made, which again, this doesn't deal with the international lack of market power in developing countries with poor resources, but in the developed world, the drug prices in the European Union are half of what we pay. Now, why is that? It's because they regulate the price of drugs. That's what you want to go a step down the direction towards a prize model, have some experiments going on. I like the idea of demonstration projects that could prove the prize model could work under various scenarios, But meanwhile, we know what will work to bring down drug prices, and that is regulating the price of drugs. And it's being done all across the developed world, and it's not being done in the United States. And so to me, that makes sense as a transitional phase to move in that direction.
All right, that brings up another audience question that came in, expanding the parameters of today's discussion, which is some comments on where we might be going, although it could be a short term at the going out of business sale by the Trump administration on a most favored nation approach to drug pricing, and what David and Charlie in particular think of that in terms of, if you don't like the price controls we have here, we can get them from somewhere else. David, you're muted, I think. Charlie?
No, David's muted.
Yeah, so look, I think the issue with importing price controls is, it's one thing to do price controls in a market that accounts for a small share of the global demand for a product. It's another to import those into a country that's a much bigger share of the demand and a much bigger share of the profits given what Amy said, sometimes over rewards, but over rewards gives us more innovation, and we have to decide how much of that we want. So, there's the goose that laid the golden egg problem here. And there are other countries free ride on our R&D. That's the objective reality. We've been willing to do that. So far, it remains to be seen how much longer. I'll stop there.
All right, well, we're just about at the end of our time. I will say to our audience that we tried to give you incentives to listen today, and your prize was hearing from all of these speakers, and hope that you are further educated and continue on in this subject. But thank you all for joining us today, and we'll remain in virtual land until our next visit. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Thank you all on the panel.
Everyone.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.